and management was the evil force that somehow ruined the companies and things like that. And I hope that's not the case.
Well,
but
I was an early programmer, actually.
So you've done both sides of the fence.
I really do appreciate that. I mean, those guys are, they do the game.
But it just strikes me that there's always that tension there between management. And when I saw that you are listed as officially the management views, I thought, good, we finally get a spokesman from the suits on the other side. This is Mr. Steven Wyatt. He's been with Atari and Activision during their heyday. And I'm just going to shut up and let him take it away and tell you what it was like to be involved with those companies at that time.
Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's on. Okay. So one of the things that I find most interesting is really more the questions, that the audience has about things that went on that time. Sometimes, if I stop and think about it, I start to feel a little old because, having been around, actually been a programmer before there actually were cartridge games out. But some of the stuff that I've done from doing Fortran 4 programming and things with numbers from before the cartridge game industry, and then from Atari, and then in Activision, being with Activision from the days when they were less than a year old and they went from $5 million to $65 million in 1 year, and from being at one building at Scott Boulevard to adding a manufacturing facility in Milpitas, and then going to Activision Twin Towers in Mountain View, to going to Telesys and being the director of operations at Telesys, and seeing how we could actually use the existing Wang family in Hong Kong to make our video games and market those. Watching the video game industry while I was at Telesys go from $29.99 games, down to $4.10, in wholesale. Seeing programmers, independent programmers that a couple of years before would be able to bring in a game and try to sell it for $250,000, and then, a few years later see programmers try to get $25,000 for a game. And then going from there to a company called Inventory Transfer Systems, which was the first, in my mind, actual electronic distribution of software, where the concept was to have any of the games that were licensed come out on any cartridge media, where you could walk into a kiosk in a department store. And there actually was one place where their kiosks came out, and that was in Great Britain, in the Menzies department stores, and they used them there to download software on a cassette tape for the Commodore 64. But it never got going in this country. So actually, I'd like to just entertain any questions that the audience might have about any of those things or any of those companies. And if not, I'll just go on. No, huh?
Not yet.
Well.
Could you just first give your timeline of where you were at in the company?
Sure. An amazing thing in 1981, in the fall of 1981, I went over to Atari and was going to work for the quality manager, actually the director of quality over there for all of Atari. And within 1 week's time, I was whisked away by Activision and got a better offer from Activision. And I was with Activision until in 1982, Activision had a family vacation, where, as I was telling Mark a little while ago, they actually decided they were going to take everybody to Hawaii. And they gave out this great little promo bag. It was a green shoulder bag that had the Activision color logo on it. And it was a little after that Telesys had taken me away. And at Telesys, as the director of operations, they had gone to the first CES show, and with two games. One, which I thought was just crazy. It was so silly. It was Coconuts. That was their first game, which, you see this guy walk back and forth. And also with fast food. And that was a lot more fun. I like that game. So I spent a good part of the next year, probably up to 2 months at a time, going over to the Far East and making sure that they were setting up, and there was tooling that was being made in this country, and also using the ROM manufacturers from this country and sending the items over to Hong Kong. So my timeline with that was into 82 and then into 83 with as they wound the company down and actually made money selling product cheap at distressed prices. At the same time, a couple of guys from Texas came to me, and they were contracted with some people inside Atari to do Atari Soft. And we did a number of Atari Soft titles, both Commodore 64 and VIC-20, and we did some disk products too. I remember we did an IBM and an Apple disk product, IBM Pac-Man and Apple Defender, Apple II Defender. That bridged into, I think it was the late 1983 to early 1984, but if anybody can correct me on that, that would be fine. Because at the same time, I had this Chicago syndicate come, and they were the ones that bankrolled Inventory Transfer Systems that was going to come out with this great electronic distribution system. And that went all through 84, right up until the end of 84, and was actually sold to British Telecom in early 1985. And
Activision, obviously, a trendsetter in business, amazing games. Telesys, which is not exactly a company known for its great games. Why?
well, and that's a good point. I mean, what was just amazing for me at the time with Activision was they were starting to come out with such great graphics. I mean, you would look at an Atari box, you would look at what Atari wanted to put out, and then Activision would just come out with these fabulous graphics, and it was extremely exciting. I think that Activision did a lot to get the video game industry, in terms of acceptance, of a product that on the screen it looked really, really good. I'm sure any of you probably in your life have had a situation where somebody comes to you and says, do you want to run the whole show on something? And, at that point in time, it was like, wow, that sounded really exciting. Sounded really exciting to, like work with the programmers and work, directly with, the head of marketing and the head of sales. And the guy in sales and the guy in marketing had been with Columbia House Record Club, and they certainly knew how to sell records. They knew how to sell tapes. They thought they could sell cartridges. And the thing in the back of my mind that was always bugging me was I had seen, years earlier, things like radar detectors and CB radios, that had these great, run-ups in sales and then just absolutely crashed. And it seemed to me like, something like that could happen in the video game industry. And so I thought, well, it probably would be a good time to get as high as I could in management, because, that would give me, in Silicon Valley, that would give me the chance to, propel my career further than that. So that's really why. But the other thing, too, that was really exciting in the video game industry was, being able to, instead of just having a job in a cubicle somewhere, it was really being able to get out and being able to, like work with different programmers or work with different marketing companies. And so that was pretty exciting. It was exciting to really just be around a lot of people there that were really making it happen. And, anybody that was around Atari in the beginning, seeing Atari go from, one building to multiple buildings and being able to be around Nolan Bushnell and just, all these people that were like gods in the industry, it was just a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun even, being with from the Activision programmers to being with all these independent programmers that were coming into Telesys all the time with games.
Questions? Had a quick, right there.
You had war stories about locking horns with some of the programmers at Atari, and from their perspective, calling people up there and so forth.
Well, not really from Atari. I got to tell you, like one of the things that there are stories about the first 5 programmers at Activision, having come over from Atari, and Atari trying to sue to get them, and having been at, I remember the first Consumer Electronics show that we came to in Las Vegas. Activision was going to put on a big splash. We did a parade in town, from, I can't even remember where it was. It was a really chilly morning. There was frost on the ground, and we were all freezing, and we were dressed in these Activision, promo things. And just, the programmers were not going to parade. They just decided, no, they were too good for it. They were not going to parade. It was too cold. You were going to get them a car or a limo or something to ride in. And Jim Levy, the head of Activision at the time, had this real, little mutiny on his hands going on behind there. And it was the same thing. That's really where I saw more of that mutinous kind of activity going on, which was, really in Activision. Not, to say anything bad about any individual either. It was really amusing to see this and to wonder, it's like, am I going to have a job tomorrow? Is this place going to like blow up in everybody's face? Because, we were dependent on the programmers. We were really dependent on them. And, at any one particular time, I mean, when you talk about people creating job security, the way to create job security is be working on a lot of games, but don't finish any of them. So that they need you right up until the last minute. So, I mean, that's really my recollection. My recollection was everybody really wondering about job security. And I would tell you, like anybody that was a staff person or a consultant that came to Activision, and a lot of people that came in as consultants went off and started a Magic and, started to work at some of these other companies. Any of them left because they were concerned about, they saw some riff and immediately they thought, oh man, I'm going to be out of a job tomorrow. So, they decided to leave.
Any questions? Okay.
So my question is about your job description at Activision, your project manager.
No, actually, I got hired in by Alan Epstein, who is the vice president, as the quality manager. But there was no manufacturing manager at the time either, and we were using Selectron as a contract manufacturer. Selectron had been contract manufacturing for Atari, and they were also making these little dumb terminals for Falco data products. And they decided that they would use Selectron to do the contract manufacturing for Activision. The people that came in Activision were extremely quality conscious. And so there was this big disconnect between what they actually wanted and what they could possibly get from a contract manufacturer. And so we actually, myself and the people that I hired as supervisors under me, we wore a number of different hats. And we were constantly, that's where the stress came in, really going from the meetings about what Activision really wanted and then having to translate that to a quality product. Also at the time that Activision was embroiled in a number of lawsuits that Atari was launching against them. Atari launched lawsuits against them for the two little pins that were in the cartridge that were supposed to lift the dust cover from the unit, saying that the type of pins we had, since we didn't have springs on them, could damage the dust cover unit and effectively damage the connector. And there were all of these little lawsuits going on in the background too. Activision came up with a piece of foam to put over the edge of the circuit board and the two little pins, to emulate the dust cover that Atari had. Well, also foam, like they had, was highly static sensitive, charge sensitive. And, this wasn't an area that we were thinking too much at the time. We had ESD connectors on people putting chips in circuit boards and soldering them. But, they'd slap this piece of foam on, and if somebody was rubbing it, waiting for a cartridge to come down the line, they do that, it went. The next station they had them plug into a 2600 to make sure that every game worked, and all of a sudden you came up with cartridges that, like, were just doing screwy things. So there was a number of disconnects there, and there was a number of, really, potential just nightmares in terms of, stress on the job and really translating the quality level that the people in management at Activision wanted to actually what came out in the box. And we felt, that people deserved it, that the consumer deserved it. If they were paying $29 or $39 for a cartridge, they deserved a quality product.
So that was quality of manufacturer as opposed to quality of software.
Yes.
And you did that with companies in the Orient?
No, as a matter of fact, one of the things that Activision, during the time that Activision did everything in-house, Activision had all of their promotional materials, all of the game instructions, all of the boxes, all of the labels and stickers, everything made in this country. As a matter of fact, we use the same vendors that Atari did. And because of that, that's another interesting story. The companies that printed the instruction sheets and the boxes and even the labels, Atari came to them and said, if you do business with any other game manufacturer. And so what they did was they actually created, you talk about with the Enron scale and everything, having companies in the Grand Cayman Islands. This was one of those situations where they had companies which were sheer shell companies, marketing companies, like on the other side, in New York and in Connecticut and New Jersey, simply for the fact of being able to take Activision's orders and have the stuff printed, somewhere, and it was printed right next to the Atari boxes. It was printed right next to the Atari, instruction sheets. But Atari was not supposed to know that, the same companies that were doing their work was doing. We had our plastic game cartridges injection molded right on the peninsula between San Francisco and San Jose by the same companies that were also doing it. Well, what they had to do was they couldn't injection mold our cartridges in the same facility that they did the Atari cartridges. So they had to find other injection molders, in the area and subcontract those out. So now it's kind of like, if you've got, a husband, a wife, a girlfriend, or a boyfriend, you're married to one person, but you're supposed to go to another house to get your meals, because the neighbors aren't supposed to know. Yeah, it's quite interesting.
Any other question? I had a question about the kiosk idea. This still fascinates me. And I assume the reason that was didn't come into effect is that the market crashed, and they, at least in this country, maybe they didn't see the games industry as being healthy at the time. But I was just surprised that that idea hasn't come up after that, considering that cartridge format continued for another decade or so, and even now with CDs, there must be some way of bypassing, the
Well, there is.
retailer and doing it right, copying disc to disc on the kiosk unit and having the consumer pay for it right from there.
It's an interesting thing, because when we were negotiating with the various video game companies at Inventory Transfer Systems, where I was a vice president, and what they would talk about was they would talk about shelf space. And what actually was very important in the video game industry at that time was how much shelf space you could have at a retailer. And Atari would have tremendous amount of shelf space. And any of the other ones, whether it was Imagic or Activision or Coleco, they had less shelf space. And it seemed like one of the conversations that would always come up, and we didn't really know how to handle it because it was a surprise to us, was, they wanted their box with their colors, and they wanted it on the shelf, and they wanted as much shelf space as possible. And so when you're going to these video game companies and you're saying, we'll actually download your product, we'll save you the money of actually having to manufacture this thing, because as we would all see, when the video game industry crashed, lots of people had lots of inventory, and they had lots of money there in that inventory. But what a number of the companies were worried about is all of a sudden the visual for their product would disappear. If their product wasn't sitting there on a shelf, people, it was an impulse buy. People wouldn't see it. People might not buy it. And it was also a prestige issue. They wanted their boxes on the shelf. And that was one of the objections that we couldn't overcome. Boxes and instruction manuals were relatively easy and fast to print and to actually have on the shelf. One of the things that they were talking about in the previous session for the collectibles was, you could have a shrink-wrapped box with a piece of blank media inside, but the value was, in the perception that there was something inside. And when I heard that, I thought to myself, now that would have been a way to get around it, where you could have actually printed the instruction manuals, printed the boxes, had them on the shelf, but you actually didn't have to go through the, making the media, whether it was a cartridge, whether it was a disc, whatever, and actually you could have had those later. You could have even mailed them to people, if you wanted to do that. Because what they did was they were going to hand out the media. You were going to have the media, the cartridge or the disc. You were going to be able to get it right then and there. And they were going to mail you the instruction booklet. Because we tried all types of little printers, dot matrix printers. There really wasn't a use of lasers at that time to try to print out an instruction manual right then and there to give it to them. And it just didn't have the look and the feel of something that was glossy and had colors to it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience?
So the question is, do I have an opinion about what happened to Atari? If you knew it, if you were able to see Atari at that time, they moved into a complex in North San Jose that was just this fabulous campus with 5 new buildings, and they had lots and lots of people there. They had an extremely expensive payroll. And I remember in the days of when they came out with the idea of Atari Soft, we would have to go over to Atari for the contracts. One of the things that we were really scared of was laying out the money to do the Atari Soft program and not getting repaid, because we had heard a lot of internal rumors at that time. As a matter of fact, a lot of people from Atari were leaving, and because they knew people inside the company, they were getting the contracts to do Atari Soft. And I remember going over there and just seeing people leaving in drones. I mean, they would go in and they would just, they would lay off or fire an entire floor, in a building. I'm sorry, not an entire floor, but an entire area of cubicles. And you would just see these people that were white-faced, taking these little white banker's boxes, cardboard boxes with their stuff and walking out. And so, I think my opinion, number one, is that Atari blindly thought that they were going to continuously be the leader in the industry, even though there were a lot of people giving them a lot of good comments about what they should be doing about their product, and they really weren't listening to them. And second of all, they had a huge payroll, and they were starting to run deficits like crazy. So, having originally been a programmer and loving programming, having been in all areas of management, and also having seen, demise of the video game industry while I was at Telesys, you know, even before I did the Atari Soft stuff, you know, I could just, the handwriting was on the wall. And for those of you that, you know, were interested in people like Jack Tramiel, who then, you know, had Commodore and went and did his leverage buyout of Atari, I mean, it was something where you could see, you know, it was going to be a house of cards, only because a person like Jack Tramiel wouldn't, you know, Jack Tramiel thought Jack Tramiel was God, and he wasn't going to listen to anybody. And so if you go into a particular business, or you go into a company that's just been suffering from something, and you get somebody else that's going to do a leverage buyout and thinks they know what to do, and they're not going to listen to anybody anyway, you know, history's going to repeat itself. So, and that's just my opinion, for what it's worth.
After the game industry, where did you go to after Telesys? And did you stay involved in any form, or was you pretty much said that's enough?
Well, you know, it wasn't so much the game industry or not the game industry. As a matter of fact, in 1985, the computer industry with inventory transfer systems, its biggest problem was in this kiosk that they were going to download. At the time, you had Z80 processors were powering rack-mounted computer systems. You know, really before the IBM PC still hadn't caught on really as a personal computer of the future, and people were using Motorola-based processor, you know, computer systems. Anyway, the computer industry also was taking a dive in 1985. But what was very interesting is that I had been working with so many venture capitalists. Venture capitalists were putting the money into the video game industry, and there were other people coming to them with possibilities. Atala, which was a company that started doing the card scan for credit cards and for ATM cards that you would see even to this day sometimes at the counter at the bank if you want to scan your card. Atala went to Jack Melchior, who was the M in Rome Corporation, and was a very big venture capitalist, and he was going to fund Atala, and I had gotten such a good reputation for being able to bring a product from imagination through to conception, you know, for the people in the video game industry, that I actually got involved with being a resource for venture capitalists that wanted things done. So I actually had a group of about 5 people that were engineers and designers for hardware and for plastics and circuit boards and things like that we started doing a lot of contract work for companies that were being bankrolled by the same investors that had invested in the video game industry. So that's something that I did for about the next 5 years and did very well in and around the video game industry right in Silicon Valley.
Any other questions? Any more questions? Okay, then I'd like to thank you, Steven, for coming.
I thank you very much for being here, and thanks very much for your questions. And thank you very much for supporting the conference here. I think this is a great place, and you know, we all enjoy it no matter, you know, what stage of gaming that we're in or what our interests in gaming are. So thanks very much.
I agree with you.